Hi, Jessica Angel, organizing along with the Vancouver Biennale this great exhibit expo with all these different voices. I'm thrilled to present this one specific keynote speaker, Cynthia Gayton. Cynthia is a lawyer. I know Cynthia from actually the Rare Arts Festival in 2018 too.
Yeah.
So a lot of people here in this expo actually come from that one first gathering a few years back. Cynthia has been really active with what started as this Telegram channel that I called #ArtProject. And then the channel started growing. We gathered all these different voices, asking all these different questions about blockchain, about how art was related to blockchain, a lot of technical questions, but also questions related to copyright, questions related to ownership that Cynthia was very happy to tackle during those early days. So I'm really excited to have Cynthia here today. I invited her to talk a little bit about her vision in the art and blockchain space, and also to talk a little bit about this installation piece that I'm presenting for the Vancouver Biennale next summer, late spring. So Cynthia is going to be talking about Voxel Bridge, this installation piece, as a sort of a tentative pilot of how a blockchain project could be an example of creating sort of a community-based project where blockchain can allow for the public to take part in decisions. And then even though this is an art project, these sort of dynamics can also be used in other realms of society. So I think Cynthia will be talking about smart cities and how this project could potentially be a tentative pilot for something experimental like that. So I'm excited to hear Cynthia's views on the subject, and I think this talk will let our imaginations kind of run wild with the possibilities that blockchain can bring to the table. So Cynthia, the floor is yours now. Thank you for taking my invitation to be here.
Oh, no problem. Thanks, Jessica, and the Art Project 2020 exposition presenter, Vancouver Biennale. And I'm so glad and grateful for pronunciation, assistance with that. And this has been very interesting to come up with this idea. It was actually because of having a conversation with Jessica about what would be an interesting subject that this came about at all. I generally talk about the intellectual property issues for digital art, for crypto art in particular. And so this kind of brings me into another area that I've always been interested in, but the other issues became more pressing. So I call this the Voxel Bridge to Smart Cities and Public Art. And I want to kind of give a little bit of a background of how did I get here? So when I first learned about cryptocurrency, generally I had an art gallery, and I learned about Bitcoin because I went to a conference where people were selling products and using Bitcoin for that process. And I thought this would be great. My transaction fees would be a lot less than the processing fees through a bank and all that sort of thing. It didn't happen because it was so hard to find people who'd be interested in buying anything using Bitcoin at the time. That was 2013. So I kind of stepped away from it for a while. And then I have a textbook that I use for my classes, and I was trying to update sections on contracts, and then I learned about smart contracts and wanted to bring that into my textbook. So it brought me back into thinking about smart contracts, contracting, and what could I do with it. And then that led to an interest in how art could be part of this whole, how there could be some solutions for what are considered problems in the art space, the provenance issues, keeping track of rights, keeping track of licenses. The possibilities were endless. And so I was, very, very intrigued. And as time went on, the buying and selling of art using blockchain technology and crypto art, and having art that depicts cryptocurrency in the physical art, as well as buying and selling, kind of took a center stage. When I first became interested at the beginning, a lot of the conversation was about the democratization of art, art investment education, and how you could use this new technology, the ideas of mass adoption, and how it was required, a requisite was understanding cryptocurrency and blockchain. How can we reward collaborative works? Next, another subject was secondary market royalties for artists. And I, as an attorney, I had a lot of, legal issues regarding all of these things, but these were some really big topics when I first got into the art aspect of smart contracts and cryptocurrency. Another kind of side area that people were interested in were public benefit ideas. Huge push on how cryptocurrency could help the unbanked. Lots of discussions about supporting charitable or otherwise societal goals, and then alternative investment channels. And all of that kind of went away in many respects because there was more interest in using art as an investment, more interest in speculative activities related to art. So I kind of wanted to step back and look, let's go back to first principles, at least in my mind, about why art is important in many ways and how it can help society. There was, I just listened to Ruth Catlow about an hour or so ago, and I had heard her speak at the Art Basel event back in Miami in 2018. And she had a panel discussion about which art problems can blockchain solve. And came out of the discussion, it was a very interesting discussion, but it was unclear which art problems can blockchain solve. And so thinking about that, how can we look forward in a way that just to solve some problems? So I'm sure some of you have participated or listened to the Dada folks, Bea and Judy. Over the past couple years, they've been talking about invisible economy. And there are so many, are we in the knowledge economy? Are we there's so many different economies that we could potentially participate in. And the invisible economy was something that kind of piqued my interest. And what I have quoted here is dealing with the idea about how people can add value to a system and how to take into account the value created as part of their participation. The invisible economy, I think, is a very interesting way of looking at value and how people contribute to it. But I also think of it as an ignored economy. These things that Dada in particular work on with regard to collaboration as part of the ethos of what it is that they do, artists collaborate all the time. People collaborate all the time. It's not necessarily measured in terms of value in ways that we can discern. There's not necessarily spreadsheets that articulate all of these things, and so it's harder and harder to measure, and so it's harder to try to assert some value when people are not looking at it, when it's ignored. So I'd recommend checking out their articles. They have at least, I think, 3 or 4 articles on Medium about this, and then they've been doing some presentations about it also. So I think it's worth a look because it looks at economies in a different way, where people are participating directly with economic success. So when Jessica and I were talking about her Voxel Bridge, and it made me curious about the history of the bridge itself, and I came up with this thought of doing a pilot reset proposal featuring Voxel Bridge. And In Jessica's material, she has a description of this being an immersive physical installation in the area under the Vancouver Cambie Street Bridge. And there on the left is a very old photo of the Cambie Street, which led to the bridge that apparently has been built 3 times. So it's a historic bridge going over, I think it's I don't want to misstate what the body of water is, but it's a very historic bridge. The area is historic, and so there's a lot of very interesting things about that neighborhood. So in going forward on the project statement, she says that this piece explores how public space can be constructed and utilized in both digital and physical realities. And here again is a view of Vancouver, again in the early or the mid to late 1800s, and then some of her renderings from the installation that's going to be put in place spring of next year. So my reset is, the idea of what blockchain was supposed to do with regard to art was resetting some ideas about art and how value can be imbued in art projects. And what do you do in a situation like with Jessica's project that is a public art installation? And we've seen art installations, many of us over many years and in very many different environments. But what she's introducing is an immersive environment, which many of us have experienced too, but this has an added element of blockchain. So what do you do when you're dealing with a public art project? There's usually some relationship with the city in which the art is going to be placed. There's usually lots of discussions. How do you finance it? What are the permissions that are required? And with Jessica's piece, the blockchain elements are part of the installation itself. So if you have a community art project, you generally have to raise money somehow. This is a different situation because this was financed separately from the town itself is not financing this. But the usual method of having public art projects and dealing with how do you develop resources in the community to finance these things, there are things called community development agreements and impact fees related to community projects and bonds in particular. And then another way to raise money for any kind of community development project is a social impact bond. How does this help or hurt the community? But I thought, well, maybe there's a different kind of bond that could be created for public art. So in the spirit of blockchain, I thought, well, maybe there could be a token-enabled public art community bond. The idea behind this is thinking about how can you finance a community art project and have it represented in tokens and find ways to raise money, just like you would do with building a road or providing some infrastructure changes to schools, all the things that public bonds do. So why would you want to do that? You want to help encourage reinvestment in existing communities. In DC, for example, in New York, also, there are displacement issues dealing with gentrification. What happens when a cool neighborhood is, the developers come in and the people who live there can't afford to live there anymore because the taxes have been increased, the rent goes up. How do you handle that? So if you're interested as a public policy issue to encourage reinvestment and you want people who live there to continue to participate, because a lot of the coolness of any neighborhood and why people want to go there are the people who are already there and what kind of energy that they bring into the communities. I'm thinking about it could provide an alternative public art financial resource. Bond is a little bit different. It is designed to be less risky. I wanted to look into testing and expanding community ownership forms whether it's in real property or intellectual property, could, in a public art space, could the actual community itself, in terms of the citizens, have an interest, an economic interest in the real property on which public art is sitting? And then the idea of passive income. So with bonds, if you've invested, if you put money in a bond, then it's passive. You are not incurring any debt. So I thought, well, why couldn't something like this happen? Now, the kind of background in terms of economics, there are two quotes I have here about how art impacts the value of real estate. There's the first quote is, it just talks about, how a developer actually follows the artist, and he uses it as a way to determine whether or not to invest and develop into particular neighborhoods because the artists are there. And then the second one is dealing with the idea of art washing. In this quote, it says, what if artists and art spaces acknowledge their role in the displacement of communities and work proactively to counter the art washing of those communities? Could they reverse the efforts of developers and rather help a pre-existing community to thrive? And that was some of the thinking behind this token-enabled community art bond. So there's also some history with regard to, in developing nations, about intellectual property and how communities can have some ownership over intellectual property. In the United States, the owners of the intellectual property tend to be individuals. The community itself, if there had been a community that created a particular intellectual property, cultural artifacts and things like that, are not entitled to intellectual property protection, mostly because who actually created the thing. And that's another interesting thing about what Dada does and some other art organizations do, is they embrace the collaboration. But it's hard to get intellectual property protection for collaborative works because the idea is that it's set in stone. Upon the application, it's set. And then anything else that comes from that is a derivative of that original work. So in this idea here, it indicates, and while the document or the book is called Poor People's Knowledge, I rather think of it as community knowledge that just doesn't get paid for it. So in theory, every person in each developing country owns a share in some IP, such as its botanical assets, traditional medicines, designs, artistic material owned by a tribe, region, or subnational group or country. Poverty can be reduced if exploitation of that IP can provide some basic income to each family. And that also went into my thinking about what could be possible with a bond like this. Is if there are certain neighborhoods that you love, there are things about it that it's very intangible. It's hard to articulate specifically what that is. DC, as an example, has changed a lot since I first moved here. It seems like just about any city right now, when I first came, there were lots of live band venues. There were a lot of creativity. A lot of the art galleries I went to were in downtown DC, and a lot of those places are closed. It's expensive to live there now. You have to weigh the cost and benefit of these things, but a lot of the things that made DC a very interesting art community, a lot of those things are gone. So what are some possible results of piloting something like this? I'm interested in expanded citizen participation in the planning of art or public art projects. I'm also interested in encouraging community artistic and cultural expression. If somehow or another you, as part of your participation and contribution, you can see in some way how the value of that community increases, and it's measurable in some way. And I think that's where blockchain might be helpful, is collecting this data with Jessica's project, there is some data that potentially could be collected, but think if there would be a way to collect it in anticipation and planning for that data to be used by the community and not a developer or somebody who has a private interest in personal investment. I also thought perhaps the results could be used to scale token art community bonds into other public policy areas. You could establish a vested interest in by the citizens in the token art community's bond success. So you get people engaged, get people interested in the solution, get people interested in the increase in economic power of the neighborhood that you live in, I think is a positive thing. What if, there's a lot of buzzwords. There are a lot of buzzwords in the crypto art community. Of course, it's community and ecosystem. They are buzzwords in the tokenverse. And I thought, well, why don't we make it real? It's different when we're having these conversations online, and it's different when we go to conferences and things like that. But what if we could actually visit places that were making these things real? So the other element of this pilot idea is the community financial well-being could be encouraged with community ownership of public art. That's another thing that is not particularly addressed in public art programs now. The community itself, is in the form of the government. It's not necessarily in the community. The community can't necessarily touch the value of a community art project. But if you could measure it in a bond, because if there's a relationship between property value increases, it could perhaps be reflected in the bond. Could test different economic relationships. Creating a community bond could, they could be given preferential treatment in acquiring the token. Just by living in the community might be sufficient for them to have a small percentage interest in the overall increase in economic value of the community. The other thing some things to take into consideration for the public, smart community design and implementation. What constitutes a public space? One thing that I've always been concerned about blockchain notwithstanding is anonymous participation. I don't like the overarching surveillance aspect of smart cities. And if you've noticed, perhaps on the slide, I've changed it from smart city to smart communities, because the smart cities, the idea is essentially that the real estate companies and developers have a greater interest than the community itself in the success of land development. I thought perhaps we could look as an example, community bonds in response to real estate value and how that could work for art-based projects, and a way to manage effectively or identify effectively collaboration and collaborative art. If the entire community is participating in an art project and perhaps even making those contributions, how can that add value that people could recognize and experience in their own lives? So some of the risks with smart cities is that there's risks such as privacy concerns, data breaches, rights violation, data manipulation. All of these things are exposed in a lot of smart city proposals. Right now, one thing to consider is the idea of international data sharing and transfer. The GDPR is a European data transfer law that's recently been applied across the EU, and it protects the private information of individuals. And so there have been restrictions regarding the United States data transfer because we don't protect citizen information or resident information as well as they would like. So personal information is more protected under the GDPR in Europe. But with an art installation, you could control a lot more, because it'd be something that was specifically designed for managing privacy issues, managing these kinds of risk data breaches in anticipation that there might be a problem. So if you plan for it, then perhaps you can mitigate it at the very beginning. You could have anonymous avatars for each person who engages with the space. Any sort of data manipulation could be seen on blockchain, which is another benefit of using blockchain in an experiment like this. So legal issues, who owns the data? Right now, if just FYI, for scooter programs, all of this information, if you rent a scooter, the data is given to your town that permits the scooter to run. It's been anonymized, but the person that you've rented the scooter from, they have all the data. They have all the information about where you started, where you went. They have your name. They're able to track a lot more about you as an individual, the companies themselves, than the city. But the city has an interest in knowing what kind of data is being collected about the citizens. But in many cases, it's anonymized, rightfully. Who owns the public art maintenance? Who would be responsible for that? It could be part of the whole bond issuance. It could be part of there's a way to pay for that. What happens as a legal concern? What happens to deinstalled public art? That is an ongoing issue. Is once it goes away, then what? How do you manage that as an artifact for that activity? The ideas of eminent domain and private real estate. So for those of you paying attention to the five points litigation and the Visual Artist Rights Act, eminent domain would mean that the government could take over property. Is eminent domain part of a concern for a public art project? And then what do you do when the art installation is on private real estate, let's say for a period of time for the benefit of a public art project? Those are things to take into consideration. What should the artist consider on all levels, whether or not it's the artist who's installing the work, as well as people who are contributing to the work? Should they grant a Creative Commons license to the community that gives them permission to use the work in ways that are articulated by the artist? Could the art be licensed in perpetuity to the city, in which case they'd be able to benefit from any sales that are generated by the art? Could the artist donate all rights to the community? There's obviously there might be some tax benefits to that, but it's also kind of a good faith element of doing the work, and who's actually paying the artist for doing the work. The artist certainly would be kind of interesting for them to also have a token community art bond that they would be able to keep for themselves. And then city planning, what types of considerations should the town think about in the future? So my brief answers to some of these questions: who owns the data now? The users are not in control of their own data right now, with regard to a lot of projects or lots of activities where the town is given access to data that the users of whatever the data is being collected for are being given to the government. Right now, for public art maintenance, public funds pay for that. What happens to deinstall public art? It kind of depends whether or not there have been arrangements made to do something with the deinstalled art. Eminent domain and private real estate. What do you do with statue removal from what's considered to be public property? So there's some long-term things to consider. What should the artist consider? Like I said, with the Creative Commons license, all of those things might be worth considering by the artist in advance so that they can articulate what their goals are. City planning. Do these things scale? This particular idea, this bond idea, how can this expand into different areas or different parts of town or across the country? It will require a long-term commitment to the program. It isn't, bonds generally mature over, a number of years. It could be modified to, to a particular type of art. We can see, for example, with Jessica's, I understand it'll be up for 2 years. So those are all long-term considerations of the town. So this is the last slide that I have, and I want to just talk about when you're dealing with community development, when you're thinking about investing in a community, you want it to authentically reflect the culture of the people who live there and the businesses. And if you want to be sincere about community-driven cultural development, you want to do the work to ensure that residents and businesses recognize the neighborhood or town as their own. You want to take into consider the long-term affordability and building income in the neighborhood as you plan these sorts of public art activities. So with that, I just want to let you all know that this is a work in progress. I welcome any ideas or suggestions. I wanted to point out a few things with my slide. Maybe it's not showing up. Yeah, for this particular book, Uneven Innovation, it's written by Jennifer Clark. She addresses some of the downsides of smart cities. I would recommend that you take a look at this if you're interested in these types of projects for smart cities. And the ideas that she's come up with is some possible results of a community-driven public art project. These things I just wanted to highlight. As I said, if there's anything you'd want to add, or if you are aware of anything similar to what I've just talked about, that would be great. Just because I didn't find it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But the main themes are these, that the blockchain could potentially be useful to manage tokens related to a bond, which would not have necessarily a lot of moving parts, but would have to be managed for the long term. And so thanks very much for listening. Looking forward to any comments that you might have. And if it seems ridiculous, I'm more than happy to hear that too. So thanks very much for listening.